Alright, hi everybody. This video is about Pavlov and serendipity. So you just saw the little schematic of how Pavlov has dogs set up. Pavlov worked with a lot of his students. Got another shirt for you here. Okay, so it's worth talking about serendipity a little bit in general, and particularly as it applies to Pavlov's work and career. So first of all, it's good to know what serendipity is. It's like a happy accident, but better. It's when something unexpected happens in research and it's understood pretty quickly, maybe right away, to be of value. So this kind of thing happened in Pavlov's lab. I wanted to tell you the story about that. More generally, don't forget that our course is often about what science is like, what science is and what it's not. And in keeping with that, we have several course themes, 3 or 4 of them, I think, pretty obviously at least, that are about that, about how science really works. So this fits in there, and there's a little bit of a lesson kind of a thing in here as well in Pavlov's story. So Pavlov was first trained as a physiologist. He actually got a medical degree in Russia, and then he had a few years of specialized training in physiology, and his goal at the time after he finished his training was to study physiology, which really means, in this context of Pavlov, to understand the structure and the function of the nerves that control various bodily functions. Pavlov started off, when he got his own lab, as you may recall, studying the cardiac system. So he was interested in the structure and the function of the nerves that controlled the heart rate, blood vessels, things like that. He made a number of discoveries about the vagus nerve, for example, which turned out to be right and are still true today, and vagus nerve is really important. Anyway, then Pavlov put more and more of his students into work on the digestive system, a very complicated system, physiologically and psychologically. And by the way, Pavlov worked with a lot of students. Where he worked, there were often a lot of medical students who were looking for a required, short, guaranteed to be successful research project that was part of their training. So they liked to work in Pavlov's lab because he got a lot of stuff done and was very successful. So he put more and more of his students into studying the structure and the function of the nerves that control digestion. And of course, one of the first places that he started to study was in salivation, which makes sense as another first because salivation is the first part of digestion. So as you might have caught on the image right at the very beginning of this video, it listed Pavlov and 2 of his students, Wolfson and Snarsky. It's a good day for names, Wolfson and Snarsky. And these were 2 of Pavlov's students that were working with the dogs in the kind of setup where the dogs were in a harness. It was loose, it wasn't restrictive. They had a chronic cannula implanted into their salivary gland so that saliva could be secreted and measured fairly objectively, count the number of drops of saliva that would come out of the salivary glands under various stimulus circumstances. Anyway, Wolfson and Snarsky had been working with the dog apparently for several days. They had been putting various things into the dog's mouth and measuring what happened to the salivary glands. Think of just food. It was dried meat powder in Pavlov's lab. And, put food in the dog's mouth, the dog would salivate. Do that for a little while on one day, repeat that the next day, and so on. But the story of serendipity picks up about here. Apparently one day Wolfson and Snarsky, it wasn't Pavlov himself, Pavlov was down the hall or whatever, but Wolfson and Snarsky noticed one day the dog gets up on the table for some more experiments, and the dog starts salivating. even before anything goes into the dog's mouth, right? Everybody basically knows this story, right? It was one of the questions I asked you about in Chapter 11 in response to discussion items. So the dogs are drooling to what we might call non-food items, it turns out, right? So in the room where the dogs were salivating, there's lots of other stuff. You know, in the book it says the caretaker would come by, and so the dogs would learn, we know now, would learn to associate the look of, the sound of the caretaker with getting food. Wolfson and Snarsky, though, first notices the dogs are drooling and there's nothing in their mouths, and they didn't understand this. And the way I like to tell the story is that basically they must have gone running down the hall to Pavlov, found him, and said something like, oh my gosh, our dog is broken because the dog is drooling and there's nothing in the dog's mouth. What should we do? And Pavlov was great in the sense that he was sort of, I think, open-minded about what was happening. He didn't say, oh, yeah, let's get rid of the dog and get another dog and start over. But instead, let's investigate this. He called it a hypothetical salivary reflex, the psychic reflex, that was salivation even though there was nothing in the dog's mouth. So that was really how what we know as classical conditioning now got started, because Pavlov basically said, let's keep investigating the salivation that happens even when the dogs don't have anything in their mouths. Let's see if this is real. Turned out to be real, right? The salivary reflex could be elicited or triggered by the sight of the caretaker, could be elicited by a pot of blank ink that the dogs had been seeing in front of them for several days while they had been getting this experimental procedure with Wolfson and Snarsky, putting food in the dog's mouth. The dog would associate the black ink with getting food, and then on the crucial day here of this story, the dog would get up on the table, see the black ink pot over there, and start to salivate, right? Today we say, oh, this is conditioned stimulus. The dog has learned about a conditioned stimulus because it became associated with food, and crucially became associated because it was a reliable signal for or a predictor of getting food into the mouth. So that's the story about serendipity in Pavlov's lab. The dogs are drilling to non-food items. For a straight physiologist, this looked like a problem because there's nothing in the dog's mouth to stimulate salivation. What's up with that? Turns out the dogs were doing something mental, right, and salivating because they had learned associations. I also wanted to point out, of course, that this story about serendipity is not isolated. In fact, the point of this video is really that serendipity happens in science. And there are many, many examples, as it turns out. Okay, science sometimes runs according to the scientific method, right? The researchers say, oh, we've got this theory, or at least a somewhat formed idea, and it leads to a hypothesis, and we're going to test that hypothesis, and we'll probably get what we thought we would get, and then we'll, analyze the data and write that up and publish it and repeat. And sometimes science works by that. I've done that kind of thing in my lab many times, as it turns out. And of course, many scientists have, but often science runs on serendipity, right? So we basically have classical conditioning because Pavlov and Wolfson and Snarsky kind of said, oh, wow, there's something here, we should investigate it further. Sure, somebody else would have discovered classical conditioning if it weren't for Pavlov, but it's a good story about serendipity. There are others, for example, in the study of the visual system, there's a couple of really famous Nobel Prize winning sensation and perception researchers named Hubel and Wiesel. In the late 1950s, Hubel and Wiesel discovered in chimpanzees that certain individual cells in the visual system, in the back of your head, would fire off. They would generate action potentials when a line of a certain orientation was shown to the chimpanzees. And Hubel and Wiesel discovered this by accident. They were trying to study something else about the visual system, and they were showing slides of different stimuli to the chimpanzees, and they couldn't get any of the cells in the visual cortex of the chimpanzees to fire off, except it turned out that every once in a while when they slid a slide into the projector in front of the chimpanzee, these cells would fire off. And long story short, it turns out that Hubel and Wiesel discovered serendipitously that whatever they were showing on the slide would have a line in the image of a certain orientation. And when that line in a certain orientation moved in front of the visual field of the chimps, these cells fired off. Wasn't what they were looking for, but it's what Hubel and Wiesel discovered. Pretty cool. There are plenty of other examples of serendipity. Recently, just, for example, totally different kind of context. In New South Wales in Australia, there's a patch of very rare pine trees called Wollemi pine. You might have heard of these. They're very rare. Apparently there was a park ranger about about 25 years ago wandering through the forest and just came upon this set of trees, and he had no idea what they were, had never seen them before. And it turns out that they're really important, apparently, in terms of the evolution of species. Very, very interesting. The name of that ranger, by the way, was David Noble. Thought you might be interested to know that. I mentioned Nobel when I mentioned Hubel and Wiesel, and I thought I would end this video by saying that, even though the name Pavlov might ring a bell, that actually Pavlov never used a bell in the way most students think in his laboratory. It wasn't like a handbell. Something sort of like a bell that probably was mistranslated from Pavlov's Russian, from the word that really means buzzer. So Pavlov used the sound of buzzers and metronomes and tuning forks, and he used lights and other stimuli that became conditioned stimuli, equivalent to the caretaker or the pot of black ink in the story I just told. Pavlov never used a bell. There was no bell. Telephone ringer kind of a thing, with a hammer between two little, dome-shaped bells, like the old, in the old-fashioned rotary phones that some of you might have seen in an antique shop. Maybe something like that, but not a bell, not a handbell, no bell. Pavlov won a Nobel Prize for his work in physiology. This was really before he figured out what that salivary reflex business was all about. So Nobel applies here, right, in two ways. Nobel Prize for Pavlov and Nobel in his lab. All right. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Really, I'm just kidding about that, but thanks for watching the video.